For the moderation of this panel, I would like to welcome Professor Eckart Köhne. Professor Köhne studied classical archaeology, ancient history, and Christian archaeology in Bonn and Heidelberg, and he completed his doctorate in 1996. He has worked in different leading positions in the museum sector in Germany. He was, for example, the director of the Rheinisches Landesmuseum in Trier in 2008, and in 2011 he became director of the and business manager of the Historisches Museum in Pfalz in Speyer. Professor Köhne has been member of the executive committee of the Deutscher Museumsbund since 2010 and was elected as its president in 2014. In 2014, Professor Köhne also became director of the Badisches Landesmuseum in Karlsruhe. Professor Köhne, thank you for accepting the invitation to moderate this panel. We are very honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and a warm welcome to all the participants, to the great audience. It's an honor to be here. And well, let's see. The first panel is on transparency and documentation, especially on the collections, and we will discuss best in the area of excuse me, best practice things in the area of documenting collections from colonial contexts, not only for Germany, but always with an approach to see the European context. And we should take into account the following guiding questions. Which additional support do German and European institutions need for documenting and digitizing collections from colonial contexts? Which matters need to be prioritized? Are there ways of improving collaboration schemes with countries and societies of origin in the areas of documentation and digitization of collections for colonial contexts? So, let me introduce the participants of that panel. Are we all together? Hopefully. First, I want to introduce Mrs. Flower Manase. She is Curator of History at the National Museum and House of Culture in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Mrs. Manase holds a bachelor degree in History and Archaeology and a Master of Science in National Resources Assessment and Management from the University of Dar es Salaam. Mrs. Manase has worked in several projects and curated national and international exhibition projects, including, for example, Remix Africa in Translation in Tanzania by the University of Bayreuth and the EU UNESCO-funded project Roads to Independence, the African Liberation Heritage. Mrs. Manase is currently involved in provenance research of museum collections from colonial context in Tanzania as well as in Berlin, under the collaboration of the National Museum of Tanzania, the University of Dar es Salaam, the Humboldt University, and the Ethnological Museum, Berlin State Museums, a project funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. Then I want to introduce Professor Dr. Wiebke Ahrndt. She is director of the Übersee-Museum in Bremen. She studied ethnology, Mesoamerican studies in Göttingen and Bonn. She undertook different study and research visits in Los Angeles and Mexico. In 1996, she received her doctorate in Mesoamerican studies. From the end of 1999 until the beginning of 2002, she was head of the American department at the Museum der Kulturen in Basel, Museum of Cultures. Since March 2002, she is the director of the Übersee-Museum in Bremen. And since October 2006, she holds a honorary professorship in the Faculty of Cultural Science at the University of Bremen. Since May 2010, she was a member of board from 2011 until 2018, vice president of the German Museums Association. In that function, she was head of the German Museums Association working groups, drawing up the recommendations for the care of human remains in museums and collections, and the guidelines for the care of collections from colonial contexts. Christian Nana Tui is curator and director of the Blackitude Museum in Yaoundé in Cameroon. He is a specialist in information and communication sciences, combining journalistic and media practices with a sustained option for the production of cultural and creative content. He is the director, exhibition curator, and creative artist of the Blackitude Museum in Cameroon. Sorry, there was another sound in here. Christian Nana is also president of ICOM Cameroon and international vice president of the ICOM Advisory Council, International Council of Museums. He is also a member of national and international institutions or organizations that specialize in the fields of art, culture, and communication, and a board member of AFRICOM, the ICOM African organization. As part of the experiences gathered during his professional career in the audiovisual media, he has been also responsible for setting up of communication companies, digital platforms, and TV. Dr. Jonathan Fein is head of the Ethnological Museum, Berlin State Museums. He has been active in addressing issues of digital transparency of museums, collections, and documentation, especially with respect to colonial contexts. He initiated a project to digitize and publish online the historical archive, acquisition files, inventories, and correspondence ledgers of the former Berliner Museum für Völkerkunde from 1831 to 1947. He is also a principal investigator in the Digital Benin project at the Museum am Roten Baum in Hamburg. He has held numerous fellowships, including a Jacob Javits Fellowship and a Federal Chancellor's Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. He serves as secretary of the Benin Dialogue Group and is a member of the German Museums Association Working Group on Collections from Colonial Contexts. So again, a warm welcome to all of you. And according to the three main questions, first question would be, what do we need to create transparency, especially on the collections? And which additional support is needed in a German and a European perspective to go further on that theme? So maybe my first ask goes to Mrs. Manase. What do you think from your perspective? What do we need to be better in transparency and documenting collections?
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to join the conference. Regarding the question, I think that we should first understand that transparency is a wider terminology that has no boundary. So when we are speaking of transparency, we should also take account of country to country, public and institutions, and even the communities. So we should also understand that we are talking of no boundary. If we are speaking of transparency, we should not consider the boundaries. And for the documentation, we should also understand the question of what and which. What are we documenting and which objects are we documenting? So it is really essential to understand before taking any steps of how should we do the preliminary works for this process of working on these colonial objects. And for my case, I think that we should understand that while we are dealing with the objects, there are those objects which have different stories. And when we speak of documentation, we are speaking about the people's life. So when we try to document people's life or past life, we should also understand there is a lot of things, including the ethics and ethos to consider. So I think we need to do a lot of work, the groundwork before starting the steps of the project.
Thank you. Are there any best practice examples where we could rely on maybe? Professor Ahrndt, can you give some remarks on that point?
I think we are not at a stage to look at best practice examples. I think there are some collections, the Te Papa Museum, for example, but also the Netherlands, which have already a lot of information online where we can have a check. But I think what Flower Manase is pointing out is that we need more than the traditional inventory lists online. That's what the databases in German museums usually are. They're digitalized inventory books with a photo in best cases. of the respective object. But if we really would like to document the life of people staying behind these objects, then we need more information in the databases, and we have to develop standards to do so. And I think it's too early to talk about best practice, but what we really need is an exchange between different point of views, different knowledge levels, and to really foster data models which have standards so that it's possible to really find our collections and the information flow Manase is pointing out, which is important to the societies of origin.
At the first point would, of course, to have knowledge about the things already existing. So for Japanese museum, this is always the first point where we have to get more information and clearance, because discussions usually only start if you know what is in the museum's collections. And is there anything to be done for that first step?
I think so, yes. I think we should really get our collections online. We need to have an infrastructure for that. It's important that people from other countries can find these collections. It's usually then they are on the home pages of a certain museum, so really you have to know where to look for. So we need also an infrastructure so that people really can find these collections. I think it's the first step that we have the inventories online, but it's only the first step. We have to continue on that path, and it will take time.
Thank you. Mr. Nana Tui, what do you think on that theme? Maybe you can switch on your microphone. So we just can't hear you. So maybe we have to clear this. So I would like to ask the same question, Mr. Jonathan Fein. Mr. Nana, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Okay.
So anybody of you, please join us.
All right, thank you very much to invite me to this panel, and I'm very happy to be here. And I think that the question of documentation and question of transparency is very important. And if we need to have a good documentation, for me, the first step, we have to see what we have now as documentation and how we can complete it. Now we are talking like the set out that documents life of people. It's not only life of people, it's life of different community. When we have community, we have to integrate also their knowledge on this kind of documentation. That is very important because we have to take those information, even it's oral, and we have to integrate it because it's a sciences process. And on this sciences process, we have to make sure that we have the good history, the good documentation of the collections. That is very important because if you don't associate the different community in this kind of documentation, I'm not sure that we have a good documentation. And talking about colonialism collection that we have not only in Germany but in Europe, I tell you. So it's very important for us to make sure that we can have many points of view and integrate people in this kind of documentation. That is very important for me. That is the first step that we can do also to start our work. Hello?
Thank you.
Hello.
Mr. Fein, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Flower and Mr. Tchuisseu. I think there are two important things to recognize, and that is that information that we put online, although the internet is, in a sense, forever, is a tool. It's a tool to understand what is where and how it got there. And I think we have to accept the fact that we should and will put things online that are not authoritative, that are work in progress, that are there as an invitation to discuss and an invitation to explore. And I think it's important that we bear in mind how we frame the things that are put online in an effort to transparency, so that we are clear that we are not 100% sure of the correctness of the information, or 100% sure of the accuracy of the information, or even that the information makes sense at all. And a third point is that we have to be open to very quickly address political wishes from partners in Africa, in Oceania, in the communities and countries from which the objects come, if they have an objection to putting the information online at all. That we need to work out with colleagues in advance what a process for removing information from an online database would be, and how, despite the decision to remove it, we remain in some sense transparent as to where it is. So I think those things are important to bear in mind.
Thank you. So when we see about the three-way strategy, which is now proposed by as we heard it in the introductions, do you think that this three-way strategy is a good starting point to deal with these different tasks? Anyone might answer.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any movement in this direction is welcome, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the amount of effort and the amount of assistance that museums will need in order to realize this strategy, both in the medium and in the long term. The efforts involved in museums changing not only their orientation towards documentation, but also their approach to digital documentation will be enormous. And I think museums need the kind of support that can only come from the political level in order to accomplish that. But we also need increased support, and that's why I think the contact point is so crucial for our communications with colleagues abroad, with colleagues in Cameroon, with colleagues in Tanzania, with colleagues in Fiji, in Ariotea, etc.
Are there any perspectives to combine that or to bring together this new three-way strategy with other countries by now? Are there in Europe other countries doing similar things? Because many of the themes are not a German thing, of course. The question is always, as Mrs. Nana said, beyond borders. So are there chances to connect this approach with things already other European maybe countries are doing?
I think other countries in Germany, in Europe, sorry, are ahead of us. They have their collections already online, their inventories online. Usually what Dr. Fein said, information on provenance usually is not online. And because it's complicated to have this information in a database, we need discussions. How can we put these research results in our databases? And what's also a huge problem also in other countries is the language. It's, when we have inventories online, it's usually in the mother tongue of the countries where the objects are stored. And we need multilingual databases, and we need standards for that as well. And what we also should, that's what I like this three-way strategy, it's really to get started at a certain point and to find a way to set priorities, because these collections we are talking about are huge. We are not only talking about the ethnographic collections, they're huge already, but if you take in account the natural history collections, then it goes into the millions. And we need a strategy where to start, with which kind of collections we should start getting them online, because we cannot do everything at the same time. And I think it's the three-way strategy gives us a possibility to really talk about these priorities, to see what's most important, what is second, and also to find ways which think in a multidisciplinary way. So not a one-way route, and to take into account the different point of views of different cultures and different perspectives. So it's a long way, and I think it's, as I said already, it's only that some countries in Germany have their collections already online, so they are a bit ahead of us. So we have to catch up in Germany in questions of digitization.
So maybe I ask again for the best practice then. So if we have to create that tool of our digital collections, maybe Mr. Tchuisseu, from your perspective, from which country Germany could learn in that aspect? So what would be good examples how to present the collections as a starting point for work? Is it okay? Could you hear me? Or maybe Mrs. Manase, if she can hear me, from your perspective, looking on other countries outside Germany, what could be good examples for presenting in a collection online? Which information should be included in that first tool, from your perspective?
Yeah, for me, I think I won't go straight to mention the country, but I feel like there is a lot to learn from other countries in Europe and also in US, because why am I not mentioning the country exactly is because I will not like to see Germany repeating the mistakes which other countries have already done. And for me, I feel like for the German, they should learn the mistakes and improve and go forward. And this mainly is on the accession of this information. If the information is going to go online, how are we going to access it? Especially both communities. And while I'm saying communities, is not only the German community, I'm speaking also of the communities of origin. So for me, I feel like it's time for the German authorities to try to see and create a new methodology which will not be more of bureaucratic to the communities of origin to access the information. So I feel like this is like an opportunity for the German to correct the mistakes which have already been done with other European countries and to come up with something which is more engaging and involving and making all these people who share maybe the information or the objects to feel they own the database, to feel they can access, to feel they can research, and also to empower now these communication and contacts which were not there.
Thank you. Mr. Fein, from your perspective, what might be the mistakes we have made so far? Or what would you focus on?
I think we're at such an early stage in many instances of putting collections of objects and information about them online that it's hard to speak now from mistakes, or in terms of mistakes, except perhaps that it's taken so long to reach this step. I think I probably take a slightly different point of view to that of Professor Ahrndt in terms of languages. I think digital tools for translating websites, software, and databases will be moving so swiftly ahead in the next few years. We've seen that with Google Translate, with DeepL, and with other tools, that the translation of information is itself less likely to be a problem. The transcription of information is likely to be a problem. And I think we in Germany, because old German scripts are so difficult to read, do have quite a high burden to do that. I think in terms of what we need to think about is we need to think about an integrated and integrative approach towards putting things online. And I say that quite carefully because what I would aim to put online are not simply objects, but objects and information about objects embedded in informational contexts. I think we can be quite audacious about how proactive we are putting things online, because what essentially we're putting online are probably pictures of objects and information from museums, which is necessarily partial in both senses of the word, incomplete and from a particular perspective. I think we could be more audacious than our other European colleagues in terms of the platforms that we create to do that, not merely putting catalogs of objects online or lists of objects online, but embedding them within platforms that enable exchange of information about them and around them, that open up people who wish to see them from communities of origin or from researchers, whether they're in the global south or the global north, to get a view of the objects in their embeddedness in their informational contexts. And there, I think, interestingly enough, the British Museum and Google Cultural Institute have taken some first tentative steps in that direction, but I can imagine others.
So I think that would be the third part of this three-way strategy, to create such contexts to make discussion taking place. And Mr. Tchuisseu, I try again. Can you hear us? What would you suppose in that context?
Yes, I think that we cannot say that it's a mistake, because any mistake we can try to correct any mistake, because we have in this kind of work start to, as we are talking, integrate the community of origin of those collections. So that is the first step. When we want to have a good documentation, we have to take the point of view of the different researchers and the different members of those society. We are talking about colonialism collections. And you know that in Africa, most of our collection is ritual. And when we have a ritual collection, we have to refer to the different society where this collection is coming from. If you don't have the good documentation and the good relationship, what I'm saying, the good relationship with different communities of origin of those collections, you cannot get a good information. Now we have the problem of how we can, when we receive all those information, how we can verify it and make the transcription to be sure that what we have collected is a good information. So that is to create a good relationship with community of origin of those collections first, and to create a good relationship with the priest and priestess, who is the people who have this collection and who know the function of this collection. And the third is also now to be sure that all those collections will have a good database, and also to have an additional information on this kind of collection. That is, for me, how we can work, how we can do to have a good collection and a good documentation. And even we want to digitalize it, it's good, and have an website and also another platform where people can contribute when they get information, when they can have more information to complete what we have received. That is very important.
So I think this is the thing we might agree here, that it's not only on documenting the objects, but also to create first maybe digital platforms, or to create a contact and to create a discussion. But that, of course, would mean that dealing with the collections would take much more time than just the first step in just opening the digital inventory. So when I think of the discussion now, you all focus mainly on the third part of this three-way strategy, to enable the contact, to enable the discussion, to enable the together work on the collections. And you might see that the first step just in publishing the objects it's really a necessary tool we have not been talking about so much. So for the German museum, this might be difficult because we always have to focus still and maybe parallel on that first thing, just to bring this ground information into the internet. Mrs. Ahrndt, how do you see this? For a museum, there have to be a lot of people then working on these things. You need a lot of resources, which maybe the German museums already do not have.
Absolutely. We need more personnel. That means we need more money. I think that's it's a complaint typical for German museums that comes on every conference I can remember of, but it's necessary, absolutely necessary. We need better infrastructure in the museums. We need more personnel to do this work because human beings are doing this work. It's not done by itself, and it is in a way a new task for the museums, even if, especially if we want to speed up, which we really have to, then we need more people. But I would add another point to the discussion, which makes it probably more complicated, even more complicated. When we discuss about open data and exchange, we talk about sharing and exchanging knowledge. And then we're coming to questions about judicial and ethical questions regarding information to be put online. Who is deciding on what? How can we bring different perspectives into this discussion? We have a lot of questions regarding this, personality rights, copyrights. When we bring objects online, people can use them for several things. They should use them for several things, but how can we make sure that the copyrights are safe, not from our museums, but patterns, for example, which come from different communities? Who is deciding on what kind of information can we put online? Who is deciding which objects should be presented with a photo, with which objects shouldn't? So how take we care on all the sensitive objects we have in the collection? I think this is something which we should add to our discussions, because in my museum, this is coming in overwhelming questions. The closer we get to putting everything online, it's where are the limits and how can we find good answers to these limits?
And therefore, you again need the contact to the communities of origin, of course.
Yes, international exchange on that, definitely, yes.
And maybe this could be a good next thing to discuss about. What are the experiences of that international exchange, and how could we getting better in that point? Maybe Mrs. Manase, what have been your experiences on that?
First of all, I feel like solving the colonial problems in 21st century, and while we are having the museums which came from the colonial production, we should also start to rethink, rework, and transforming the museum ideologies, because we are trying to solve the museum colonial problems while we are sitting on top of those problems which were already created by the colonial structures we have not yet changed. Why am I saying so? Is because we cannot document the collections which we don't have the information, the right information. We might have the information, but they might not be the right information. And this is where we are trying to solve the question of who should decide and what should be put on the database. Because if you have the right information, you will clearly know where the objects came, how it was used. So we are talking about the meaning, the context, and also the function. And once you know the meaning and the context and the function, it will guide you to know whether the object should go public or should be classified or should be, again, communicated to the community for restitution. Maybe it has more meaning to go back to the community. So for me, I feel like it's really important to consider the provenance research while we are also rethinking, reworking, and transforming our museum ideologies. And this is not only in Europe, but also in Africa, because we all inherited all these colonial structures and we are now trying to solve their problems while we have not reworked and rethink and transforming them. So I feel like while we are also trying to document, we should also have the information, the right and proper information from the provenance research.
So maybe on that topic, Mr. Tchuisseu again.
Okay, yes. Right, I agree with my colleague of Tanzania. That is a very good question, because now we don't have museums like European. I have participated last week for a workshop here about those questions of museums. What can we do now concerning museums in Africa? Did we have the same identity with European museum? I say no. Now Africa, here in Cameroon, we're trying to have a new museologic aspect and a new museums, because now we try to don't have the same position to the museum definitions, because that is very good when we to have our own museum's identity. That is very good for us. And also when we try to make inventory of different places here in Cameroon, and also the collection that museums that we can have here on the different museum space, it's very important to rethinking the relationship that we have learned from the European museums, and make and how we can say that, to recontextualize this point of view of museum. We have a good experiences on share our different, to let museum, and especially German museums, to rethinking the documentation on those different collections that they have there, and how they can use those collections, and how, as some of our colleague talking about, to know how we can put the different collection online, who will give us the right information, or who will allow us to make a good documentation, have the wrong documentation. Because the problem that I have several times when I arrive in the museum in Europe is that when I look and when I read most of documentation of most of presentation of artifacts, I'm not agree a lot of time with the presentation, because there's a small mistake, or say there's most of time wrong information, because they are not making a good research from the collection coming from the different countries, not only from Cameroon, but only from other parts of Africa. So when I have this kind of documentation, I think that we need to be close for the community of origin, and to be close in the field with the different people who are taking care of those collections. And those people will give very good for me how we can do something like that.
Thank you. I found it very interesting that you spoke about the museums in your countries and how they understand their work and how they change. And that is a different understanding of museum, like we have it in Europe. And we had this big discussion on ICOM worldwide. Of course, even in Germany is a strong discussion about that. So maybe we ask Mr. Fein, could you imagine how your museum would change in that process of working with the collections of colonial context, working with the communities of origin? Do you expect your museum's situation and will change during this?
I hope so. I think that's the only reasonable position. I think one has to be aware of the fact that there are different kinds of museums with different kinds of missions. And I think the kinds of museums that are in the focus today, museums that one would broadly call ethnographic, are museums that focus on, or should focus on, understanding the plurality of cultural positions that exist in the world and the plurality of questions that people around the world are posing and have posed in the past. And of course, by working more closely with museums in other countries and with communities of origin where the objects come from, our own questions change and our perspective on the objects for which we are at the moment guardians and have a responsibility changes. I think the most interesting challenge will be to deal with different approaches to authority about knowledge. Because I think in many European institutions, we're growing accustomed to the idea that we hold no monopoly on authority about information. But I think in many other contexts, there are clear lines of authority about who is entitled to speak about the meaning of an object, who's entitled to be initiated into secret information, and whether that can be given or not given. And that may lead to interesting processes of negotiation. But it's also important to bear in mind that when we talk about digitization and online publication, we're not talking about an on or off switch. There are different degrees of transparency that are possible. So for example, my museum has taken the position that for certain objects, we will give a record of the object into the internet, but we will not give pictures of the objects into the internet because those images have been expressly asked not to be shown. That comes up sometimes with colonial photography, where images of tremendous violence may be shown and the descendants of the people in that community or of the people pictured may not wish the violence to be depicted again. I think from one of the comments, one of the things that I'd like to pick up was a question about what does transparency mean when there's an immense quantity of data? Because if we, as German institutions, are now going to be entering onto these three roads, we will imagine that we will be creating tremendous amounts of data in the future. And I think we have to think very carefully about what are the kind of key pieces of information that people need to find the things that they're looking for quickly. And therefore, I think we need to initiate a kind of higher level dialogue with colleagues in other countries about how people in other countries are interested in using digital data, how they search digital data, whether photographs, whether images, whether keywords, whether geography are the kind of factors that we need to be looking at. And I think we shouldn't prejudge which pieces of information are likely to be the most important. So I think we need to, you ask whether we should be involved in the third stage of the longer, the third road, which is the sort of longer perspective on developing a platform. But I think we need to, in some sense, begin that conversation right now in order to reach the kind of transparency that other users of the data, regardless of where they are, find easy and transparent.
I disagree a bit with you, Dr. Fein. I think we cannot anticipate all the questions people ask to our collections now and in the future, and from different countries and perspectives. So I think we have from the beginning, we have to talk about the retrieval. We have to talk about open data. We have to talk about the technical possibilities to search in our collections from different point of views. And you also have to think about our visitors who sometimes come up with questions which are not our questions, and maybe look for objects which are blue or which show something female or something like that. So we really should talk about retrieval and the technical possibilities to that. And for that, we need, again, exchange of different point of views. We need research on this so that we are really create open data where people can really search and from different perspectives. And I think this is still something we should also discuss internationally with different communities of origin to really anticipate a bit, but I think we cannot anticipate the questions of the future. We're living in the now and then.
Any comments on that? Yeah, I just wanted to ask Professor Ahrndt whether you think that museums and collections holding that objects have the proper mindset to do all of this. And that you are all part of your local organizations and governments. You are part of the city of Bremen, of the state of Bremen, sorry. And do you have enough support from them? And is the mindset of the museum as a museum ready to do all of this? I just wanted to ask because museums are run by lots of people. You need many persons doing all that work. And it's a process of change, of course, because there are new things to do about. And is that a point we have shortly to talk about, what we could do in this on this point?
Yes, I think this is an important topic. We discuss it in the Übersee-Museum almost every day, that we have to work on our digital mindset. People work with these collections from different perspectives in the museum: restorators, curators, digital strategy officers. Me as a director, we have all different point of views already. And we have to really work on to make sure that these collections will be online, and how do we act with that. And so I think this is still something to do. We have still to work on our skills. Most people like me, we are coming from an analogous generation. We are still in a learning process on all these digitization questions. And I think we have really to work on that in the museums. We have to enable our employees, our personnel, to develop this digital mindset and to do this. And I think in the you talked about the city of Bremen. Yes, they see digitization as a major objective. They really have to. They start giving us money to do this work. But I think my discussions, not only in Bremen but with others, is it's for them it's all shocking to see how many objects we are talking about. I think they hope that this work would be done within a few years, and it won't. And it will probably last forever because it will never be finished. So we really have to bring the museums in a situation to work with their digitized collections, not only now, but in the future. And this needs skills, this needs personnel, this needs funding and infrastructure. So I think it has to change. If the politicians and the administrations really want that the museums act differently from now on, they have to give the museums the funding to do so. And I think this is something which I feel it's in the discussions in the administrations, the issue is seen, but the funding is still not enough. If we continue in the way we do right now, we are in a slow motion process, and I think nobody has the patience to continue in a slow motion process. So we need more funding on that. Yeah, but we also need the skills in the museum.
And of course, we need permanent funding. And
yes, we need permanent funding. It's nothing where you finance a project and then the project is over and the people are gone and it's in a static level. So we really need continuous funding.
So, with a view on the time, maybe we should go over to a Q&A session. But if the participants wish to have any additional remarks for last,
I'd like to pick up on one of the questions from the chat because I think it's important, and I think it leads to a dilemma that in a sense there's no way around, and that is that digitization is not merely a sort of neutral creation of information. Structure is content, and content affects structure. I think we need to not just be talking about the sort of publication of limited things from museum databases, but as Professor Ahrndt said, the effects of a kind of open data policy. The question that I have is, if the creation of the kinds of data structures and digitizations projects we're talking about now determines the kind of epistemologies that those data sets reflect, in what sense is it possible to move outside of the kind of colonialist mindsets that have informed the creation of digital structures up to this point? And I think that that's an open question. I see no clear or easy way through that. And it's for me the sort of large nightmare that looms behind a kind of initiative like the one we're talking about. In other words, are we projecting colonialism further into the digital age in a way that we will regret in 20 or 30 years?
Thank you. Mrs. Manase, do you have a final remark before we go to the Q&A section?
Yes, thank you. I do agree with Jonathan in a lot of points he has tried to raise. And I think for the documentation project, we should not focus on putting everything to the internet. We should also consider that the replication, when the replication occurs, it will all go to the museum. Because if the museums, they don't understand the objects and they are forced into the position to put everything online, at the end, all these blames will fall to all these curators. And for me, I feel like for the authorities and for the practitioners, the cultural practitioners and people who are in position to change things, they should first understand the transparency, as I said, without boundaries, meaning that first we should understand the aspect of ownership, who owns the object before you want to put everything online or to create something else. We should then classify the objects, because the objects that Europe has, the objects that the museums in Germany have, they were not meant only for public. Some of them were meant for certain community. And within the community, there are some of the objects which were meant only for a section or a group of people. So we should all understand all these classifications behind the objects. And then we should go to the agreement then. After we have all this information and necessary documents, we should have kind of the agreement that how to go about putting now everything on the online. Because as Jonathan said, after some years, we might regret all these efforts that we are trying to do right now.
Thank you. Mr. Tchuisseu, your final remark?
Yes. A lot about what I'm going to say. But I say that we are talking about colonial collection. And when we have this kind of colonial collections, we have to be careful when we want to have documentation and to have a lot of transparency when we write this kind of documentation, when we need to have sources who will give us those kind of information. So we have to be careful when we collect it, because if you are not careful, we will have a wrong information most of the time. So, and the agreement with the local community is very important, because we have different kind of collection and artifacts in museum, not only in Europe. So we have to advise people to let to be clear when we need this kind of documentation, because when we approach the kind of we are talking about memories. We have the guardian of memories here in Africa, and most of the time in different space here in our kingdom. So we need to be careful when we need sources to collect those kind of information. And when we are talking also about transparency, transparency is very important, because the two parts, part in Europe or part in Africa, because we are talking will be integrated and will work closely on this kind of work. So that is very important for me, the way that we can start to work on this kind of colonial collection, and to be clear with local communities. I'm very insist on this question, because if the local communities of origin was not integrated on this kind of work, we cannot have a good documentation, and we will have a kind of agreement with them to let them be confident that we are working for them to collect more information on those collections that we have in Germany. So that is what I can say.
Thank you. So we go on for the Q&A section, I think. Mrs. Paris.
Professor Köhne, yeah, thank you very much. And also to all participants, we have many questions. We'll try to answer maybe 3 or 4 of them, because we don't have too much time left. The first one is maybe related to what Flower Manase was just saying, and it is about the preference of the countries and societies of origin, whether for documentation and transparency they would like a swift online publication of databases to initiate dialogue and knowledge sharing and to identify problematic holdings, or whether they would rather work on a year-long or a long-term comprehensive documentation process before publishing, which I mean, this would delay, of course, transparency. But what would you rather have? Something fast so that you can identify the objects really fast, or a long-term, more comprehensive process?
I think for my case, I would rather prefer a gradual and accurate, at least accurate. I can't say 100% accurate, but at least accurate process. Because sometimes while we are working at the museum, I know the museums are political institutions. So as the curator, when you are trying to react and to fit in the political agenda, you might miss the essential part of the community and the cultural values associated with objects. As I said, these objects and the documentation process, we are trying to recreate life. We are trying to bring all this life into reality, and we are trying to recreate the identity of people whom we have not even met. So for me, I will feel like I'm not trying not only to fit the political agenda, but I'll try to balance, have something which is gradual, not the slow process at all, but something which is moving and at least accurate, where we will find the balance between the politics and the community's wishes. And again, trying to preserve the values and ethos to these objects.
Thank you very much. Another topic that was very present during the discussion is, of course, the cooperation with the countries and societies of origin. And on that respect, there is a question also from the audience. when you speak of requests of or perspectives from societies of origin, whom exactly do you have in mind? Government representatives of modern post-colonial states, or traditional or community leaders? Maybe that would be a question for Christian, Nana, Tchuisseu.
All right, thank you for this question. I think that when I'm talking about community of origins, it's a local community because the object is coming from somewhere. Object is coming from somewhere to move to Germany or to move to Europe. So most of time, local community was not integrated when we want to have more information on these artifacts and documentation. So it's very important to be close of those people to collect more information, even if it's oral, collect more oral information and try to verify it because we are in the sciences domain and try to verify it before making an good documentation. Because if you are not if you are not close of those local communities, in local kingdoms where the object and artifact are coming from, we are not sure that we will have a good documentation on this artifact or on these collections. So it's more important to have those local this kind of work when we want to have a good documentation. And we are transparency. Transparency means what? It means that we need to explain to the people where the artifact is coming from, that we are doing these documentations and we are doing documentation on artifact or on collection coming from your community. And I'm very happy because we have this kind of discussion here, because here in Cameroon, we are starting to have a kind of map of different local communities who have collection or artifacts out of Cameroon. That is very good for us to start with this kind of map, because with this map, we will know where collection who is in Germany coming from, where collection of who is in France is coming from, in US and other part of the country of the world. So it's very important for me to start to integrate local community in this kind of work and to have more transparencies on what we have to do.
Thank you very much, Christian. Now, there is a question maybe for Professor Köhne. A member, someone from the audience is wondering whether or what could be the role of ICOM or museum associations in Europe in handling and transmitting return information requests, in particular from the countries and societies of origins. I mean, how do you see the role of museum associations in Europe in supporting this transparency and documentation process?
I think the first thing is to bring on information and to bring on discussion and to set some, let's say, guidelines or best practice examples. Professor Ahrndt did two things on the ancestral remains, as well as the dealing with the objects from colonial contexts. So we are providing as much information as possible and giving best practice and tips for handling with these themes. I think that is an important task, and Professor Ahrndt could talk more about that thing. I think the other thing is to bring these ideas and to connect the European countries. And since the German Museums Association is more focusing on Germany, that would be a task we could talk to the ICOM people, of course, and to the network of the European Museums Organizations, NEMO, which is also connecting the European museums. But our role is, I think, to moderate, to organize discussion and to bring the museums together.
Thank you very much. There you have an additional role as president of the German Museum Association. I think I'm moving to another question, maybe to Professor Ahrndt. You mentioned maybe the challenges of documenting religious or sacred objects. And we have a question from the audience on how we should deal with these subjects and put the information online. What would be your suggestion on that?
I think if we talk about transparency, yes, we have to put them online. Dr. Fein already said how they do it in Berlin. I think it's a good practice and to bring basic information and really to take into account if it's worth, or is it allowed to have a photo online, and really to think about this. There are sensitive objects where you can have a photo and there are others where you aren't. And if you're not sure, maybe you leave the photo away for the beginning. And so go step by step. But yes, you should take this into account that it might be difficult. And at the same time, of course, you have to take into account that if you want to have transparency, then you have to bring at least basic information online. So it cannot be the right answer not to bring anything, because then the information would be hosted in the museum alone, and this cannot be the solution.
Thank you. And there is when I think that the cooperation with the countries and societies of origin is very relevant. A last question maybe for Jonathan Fein, and it's regarding databases. Someone from the audience said that our databases in Europe maybe are object focused. Can we think of an online tool which is more focused on collectors and maybe collections from colonial context, and in which maybe some objects are mentioned and maybe others not?
At the moment, I can't think of that kind of tool, because when I imagine a database, I imagine most museums have been trying to sort of put as much information as they possibly can online as responsibly as they can. But I think what I'm hearing, or what I've heard this morning, is a basic consensus on the goal of transparency, but divergent points of view as to how we get there and what kind of curated information should be made transparent. With Flower sounding a note of caution, and with Mr. Tchuisseu indicating that the creation of information and the sort of publication of information must occur with communities of origin. And I think that those notes of caution stand somewhat in contrast, I think, with the positions that have often resonated through the European press in terms of the greatest possible transparency with the greatest speed at the moment. And I think we need to begin to consider how to bring those goals together. I would like to propose, however, perhaps a slightly different approach, and that is an approach in which perhaps museums or countries outside of Europe designate a digital repository in each of their countries for open data concerning objects possibly from their country around the world, which would then enable the structures in each country to begin to develop their own approach to what they wish to see online, how, when, at what pace, and with what information. And that information could then be shared back with digital repositories in the global north. I think we need to think more broadly about who needs to be in the steering seat about these issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Köhne, for the moderation of the panel. And I think also all participants for your very important contributions. We now have a break.